Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with my good friend, John Van Leeuwen. We've known each other for years, and John, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Will. I've been looking forward to being part of this.
So, John, I know you do a ton of your work in the oil and gas industry, and I asked you a while ago to give me a bit of a primer on the industry, and thanks so much for coming on the show to do that. I was hoping that, I've heard the terms upstream and downstream, and maybe I have some idea what we're talking about with those terms, but would really love to hear just a real primer on oil and gas and just walk me through the whole value stream from just the very beginning on the left-hand side to the gas pump on the far right.
I'm looking forward to doing that, Will. But the first thing I wanted to say is, in the oil and gas industry, safety is paramount because we deal with hot things that can kill you. And so typically when we start a meeting in the oil and gas sector, we start with a safety moment.
I love it.
And I think given that it's coming up on the beginning of school year, we all need to be reminded to go a little slower, take a little more time, watch out for those school zones that we've been flying through this summer. So that's my safety moment.
I love it. I was in the nuclear Navy, and having a safety briefing is part of a lot of things. And that was the first safety briefing on the show. So it took almost 430 episodes to get to a safety briefing. I'm glad that you brought that up. Be careful out there.
So so let's jump into it because this is going to. There's a whole litany of terms that we're going to have to introduce. As you mentioned to start off with, you talked about upstream. Now, upstream really talks about or focuses on drilling wells and producing oil from the well or gas from the well, hydrocarbons, we should say. But it starts much earlier than that. We need to start with exploration and development, and many of the companies are going to have to go and contract with governments for leases or for opportunities to drill and to explore in various sectors of the world. And so you've got upstream and exploration, and before exploration, you have to do seismographics. So you have to actually figure out what's underground by exploding explosives and then looking at the reflections of the signal that hits rock and hits other formations underground. So when you move from seismic into exploration, then you are looking at finding oil and gas that may be 10 or 20 or 30,000 feet below the surface of the ground. It may be under 10 or 15,000 feet of water. Once we've explored and found oil or found gas, then you're going to develop those wells. And so you're going to drill a drilling program to develop a number of wells, and you're going to connect those wells and produce the oil or the gas. So that's the kind of what upstream is in a nutshell. There are a number of companies, all the large oil majors that are involved in it, but there's a lot of companies that you might have heard of, things like wildcatters, people that go out and get a few $100 million and try to find the next major oil find. Now, moving from upstream, we have what's called midstream. And typically on land, you would have gas gathering or oil gathering systems that would gather the hydrocarbons into a central location and then pipe them to the downstream refining facilities. You may have heard of, in the U.S., we have the Keystone Pipeline that's had a lot of press recently. There's a number of other pipelines that have had a lot of press. And that's the easiest way to move hydrocarbons on land. Of course, when we're moving hydrocarbons, oil and gas from Middle East or other locations, we're putting them to tankers or even trucking the hydrocarbons. Beyond that, we have downstream, and downstream typically focuses on refining assets, where we're taking the oil and heating it up and putting it under pressure and separating the oil into various components. You can have light ends, such as ethane, methane, propane. You're going to have gasoline, and then you're going to have heavier material like diesel and even asphalt. Beyond downstream, then you typically have what they call marketing, which is selling the products either through the gasoline retail station or other means of distribution. In parallel with all these upstream, midstream, downstream, we also have the whole gas stream, and we have what we call natural gas liquids, which has been very popular in the U.S. recently and sort of spearheaded the chemicals industry in the U.S. with the prevalence of ethane from fracking, which gets me back to something that I missed in the upstream. There's a lot of discussion around conventional and unconventional oil and gas. And unconventional oil and gas has what we call fracking or fractionation of the rock. And that's where we're breaking up the rock so that the hydrocarbons that are locked in the rock pores can come to the surface. If I continue, another element of downstream would be the petrochemical industry. And without oil and gas, we wouldn't have a significant portion of our petrochemicals, including many of the plastics that we use in everyday life today.
Okay, so I'm going to pause you there because I got a couple questions.
Absolutely.
So I do want to get to some business stuff, but I just got some technical questions that I've always wondered about. So,
Sure.
So drilling these holes that are 20,000 feet deep, like almost 4 miles deep, I guess just, being kind of ignorant about it, I kind of had this, I would just picture it of being some kind of this drilling and this rig being kind of something that would be turning up at the top and this big long kind of metal, super long kind of drill bit, drilling down. But I'm thinking, okay, you can't have a 4 mile long, drill bit because it's just going to shear. So how do you actually drill 4 miles down into the earth? Like, is the drill just kind of some motor at the bottom of this thing? How wide are these holes?
A very good question. It's actually pretty amazing what the oil industry has been able to do. I don't know all the technical details because I'm not a driller, but on the horizontal drills, on the vertical wells, you actually do drill with a drill pipe down 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. But what's really interesting about drilling is they actually do horizontal drilling. So how do you go down 10,000, 15,000 feet and then start drilling horizontally? And they actually do have a motor, but they don't have a motor in traditional mindset that you would have like electricity powering the motor. They actually power this motor with a material called mud, drilling mud, which is a liquid that they pump down into the well, and they force it through a thread system that causes the drill bit to turn and then actually drills the hole. Pretty interesting how they've figured out how to do all these things 2, 3, 4 miles down in the earth.
Wow, that's incredible. And how wide are these holes that go into the ground?
The diameter is often about 9 or 10 inches.
Wow.
So you can't fit much down that well.
Yeah. Holy cow. All right. And do they have to reinforce it all the way down, or is it just solid rocks? I mean, I would just imagine that the rock might shift and, knock some rock into there, and then you got to drill the darn thing out again. So
you're a very curious guy, and you're asking really great questions. At the top of the well, you're going to cement the well in. You're going to cement a pipe, a producing pipe. So they actually do support the well bore with cement and with a pipe. There are other issues that you have to deal with down in the well. You have maybe sand that might want to come in the well. You may have other elements that might come in the well. So they do run a metal casing down the entire length of the well. And in some cases, you're going to use screens to keep the sand out of the well as well.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, question about pipelines. I've always just wondered this. I should probably just look it up on YouTube or something. But since I got you on the phone, uh, do those pipelines have pumps every so often? I mean, how do you keep the oil or the hydrocarbons moving along?
They absolutely do. There's two types of pipelines. There's a gas pipeline and an oil or a liquid pipeline. They operate slightly differently. Of course, the liquid pipeline, you can have a pump every 20, 30, 40 miles. And a gas pipeline, you're going to have a compressor to compress the gas. But what's interesting about the liquid pipelines, if you have what they call a products pipeline, you can actually put gasoline and then put diesel and then put different products like regular and premium gasoline into that pipeline and then just separate it, between the different products. And they don't actually mix that much. So you can actually have regular fuel and then premium fuel in the same pipeline.
That's amazing.
Yep.
All right, cool. So back to the business side. So there's all these different aspects of oil and gas, and I guess I would imagine. I mean, this is sort of the most obvious thing to say, but sort of an unusual industry to some degree because the end price is fluctuating so much, right? The price of oil is always going up and down. So, like, but some things probably they just have a cost what they cost. So, where along that whole value chain do things get particularly squeezed? I mean, probably I'm just guessing that the pipeline cost is sort of what it is. Like you don't pay more or less depending on the price of oil that day. So, like, who really kind of gets squeezed if the price of oil goes down, and who makes a ton of money if the price of oil goes up?
Well, the oil industry is a true commodity industry, and so price is really driven by supply and demand. Now, a lot of companies will just take a tolling cost for, transporting oil or gas in their pipeline. But some people will get greedy and say, okay, I want to have a certain percentage of the price or the value. And so they will, they'll want to participate in the upside as well as the downside of prices. So when prices are looking really good, of course, they're going to look for a upside, and then they're going to try to pull away and go more to a tolling agreement or a tariff agreement when prices are going down.
Talk to me about the structure of the industry a bit in terms of the companies. I mean, we've all heard of the big sort of consumer name brand companies, Exxon and Mobil and so forth. But what are there places in the industry where it's lots and like highly fragmented and lots of companies that the average person's never heard of? All just to talk to me about some of the that whole ecosystem.
Very good question. This is a highly entrepreneurial-driven industry, and I'll get to that in a point. But everyone knows the big oil companies. We call them the IOCs, or the integrated oil companies. Going the next level down, we have the independents, or the smaller majors, and those independents might be like a Devon or a Apache or a Pioneer. You may or may not have heard of those names. Beyond that, we have a lot of smaller companies. And what's really happened in the U.S. and it's powered the industry is a lot of private equity-backed oil companies. These are oil executives that have come from the larger companies, received $100 million or $200 million or some number to go and acquire some land and develop some wells. What backs up all the oil companies is a very large ecosystem of oil field service companies and oil field equipment companies. This has happened sort of 30, 40 years ago. The oil industry was much different. We had the integrated oil companies were fully backwards integrated in the value chain, and they could provide all their services, drill their wells, and do everything else. But over the years, they have spun out a lot of these services and equipment programs, and so now they rely on a large ecosystem of service providers and equipment providers. And so, and then what you have happening is a lot of these companies have people that decide to leave and develop a new technology and service the industry again. So you have hundreds and hundreds, at least in the U.S., you have hundreds and hundreds of small independent service organizations that have gone out and bought some equipment and are now providing services to the large oil companies.
That's interesting, and I imagine at some scales, it sounds like there might not be big opportunity, big economies of scale. Like if you're, providing a service at some oil field, you don't get a lot of benefit. If you're, we're much bigger organization with overhead. Is that the idea?
Well, you got to think about the industry in multiple segments. Clearly, if you're building a major if you're developing a major oil field in Guyana or Russia or in the Gulf of Mexico, you're going to need to go with a larger organization that can fund it, that can take on the risk, and has the technical wherewithal to undertake a major multi-billion-dollar oil project. But when you get to the smaller fields in Arkansas or West Texas and New Mexico, yes, you can go with much smaller organizations.
Give me either, not necessarily specific names of companies, but sort of describe for me a couple different types of companies that are in that smaller scale of oil field services. You mentioned renting equipment. Like what kind of equipment might they rent, and how does that business work?
If we go back to the upstream, that's primarily what I'm talking about. You have to drill a well, you have to complete a well, which is doing the fracking of the well, pumping chemicals into the well bore to develop it. Then you've got to run your cementing, you've got to run your casing and run your cementing, and then you've got to put a wellhead on it. So there are companies that are focused on each element of drilling and completing a well. Once the well is completed, of course, you have to tie that well in to the pipeline system, and then you have to produce the oil or gas subsequent. And as you'd said earlier, wells can silt up, they can sand up, the well bore can collapse. You also can get paraffin and other materials forming in the well bore, and so frequently you have to treat the well with chemicals. So let me just focus on one area that you probably have heard of before. It's pumping services, which is basically fractionation of the well bore. There are big companies like Halliburton, Liberty, Schlumberger that have been doing pumping services for quite some time, and they'll have large fleets of equipment, billions of dollars of assets focused on pumping. But over time, they develop their technology, and there's equipment available in the market for a lot cheaper. Either it's used equipment that's been sold, or even bankrupt companies that have had their assets taken over and then sold at auction. And so someone with a beat-up F-150 can go and buy older technology equipment and start a business pretty much on the cheap, and do something similar, not as good, but they can provide it at a lower cost point.
What about staffing firms in this industry? Is there a lot of sort of independent workers who will kind of work on a project for a while, but then that project gets fully cleaned up or pumped or drilled or whatever? So are there a lot of independent professionals in this space?
There are a lot of, I would say, independent laborers, maybe less independent professionals, but there are independent professionals that have technical backgrounds, engineering, that are completions, drilling, a lot of technical folks that'll go on a well site, be there for a couple of weeks, and then move on to the next well site. Yes, it's a very transient labor force. You also find a lot of people, particularly overseas. You'll have a number of technical people that'll go overseas for 4 weeks on, 4 week off rotations, and that's just the way of life.
and transient and so independent labor force as well. So there'd be a
Hmm.
lot of more labor type of workers who are kind of the people who would do either maintenance or work on the drilling equipment
Hmm.
or so forth that
Yeah,
will kind of go from job to job.
that's right.
Interesting. Um,
And you'll even see this in the downstream. What's amazing is you look at a refinery and there may be only 600 or 1,000 people employed at the refinery, but they'll have another 1,000 or 2,000 contractors that are there periodically, sometimes permanently, doing maintenance work, and then many times these refineries have to come down for 2 or 3 weeks for a turnaround every couple of years to repair things and to clean out things. And then you might have 2 or 3,000 people on site during that repair time.
Talk to me about some of the types of consulting projects that you'll see in this whole industry. What are some of the common things where some of these firms will rely on management consultants for
Yeah,
support?
I mean, they'll rely on them for many different types of functional work. I think one of the challenges frequently in the oil industry is because it's such an entrepreneurial driven industry, sometimes they're more comfortable figuring it out on their own than using a management consultant. But we've done organization work, done quite a bit of due diligence work on private equity companies looking at acquiring other organizations. Quite a bit of supply chain work. What people don't really realize is that to drill a well or to move hydrocarbons, it's really a logistics and supply chain. If I'm going to drill a well, I need to make sure everything is at the well site at the time when I need it. It's not there early, and if it's late, it could cost me $50,000 or $100,000 a day in equipment that's idle and people that are idle because I don't have the right part there.
I can I can see wanting to avoid that.
Yeah, we call that non-productive time, and that's something that most oil companies measure very carefully.
Yeah. For independent consultants in this space, like what are some of the other types of maybe trends that you're seeing, or other types of kind of themes, either around like data and analytics or around, digitization of processes, some common themes you see in other
Yeah,
industries, or anything around crypto or blockchain, or curious what are some emerging things that you see?
yeah. I mean, digitization and blockchain and all that are things that people are interested in and talking about. And many of the large oil companies do have digital programs. But I think the two biggest things that are really at the three biggest things that are at the forefront of most oil companies right now is first the energy transition, and many of them have committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. That's a high order when you actually produce a product that produces carbon. So they've got their work cut out. I don't think they all know what they're going to be, how they're going to get there. And if I'm the CEO of a company, I'm going to be retired before I get to that target. But they clearly have to work through that. Secondly, is just the broader ESG phenomena, and yes, part of that is energy transition, but also social governance. What's really hitting most of the oil companies hard right now is with the energy transition. They're having to move from thinking about being around forever and ever to having a terminal value on some of their assets, which is zero now. And so the investing community is now looking for positive free cash flow, as opposed to before that they would value oil reserves in the ground. And so that has been a major transition of moving towards positive free cash flow and distributing more of their income and their cash flow to the shareholders.
That's really interesting. You certainly politically you see a lot of people are kind of denying, that carbon is contributing to climate change and so forth. But it sounds like inside these companies, there's this recognition that yes, we need to go, move away from carbon, and that's just the reality of what's happening in the world. So it's kind of interesting, like maybe the people who some of the more frontline workers or might be voting for politicians who just sort of deny climate change is happening, but actually internally at the board level and at top exec level, people are, kind of accepting and kind of making strategies around it.
That's a good point. I actually like to group them into three groups. There's the advocates or the first movers. There's the realist, and there's the denialist. I live in Houston, Texas, and there are a lot of denialists that believe that 2050 is not doable, and that we're going to be needing oil and gas for some time. We are going to be needing oil and gas for quite a bit of time, particularly for the chemicals industry, but it's going to change dramatically. Over the spring, several of the oil companies had a real comeuppance. Shell lost a major court decision in the Netherlands. Exxon had two more environmental friendly board members voted onto its board, and Chevron had another program that came up. So all of the big oil companies are now recognizing that they have to embrace and be thinking about energy transition.
So does that mean that they're kind of figuring, okay, we can only be running this refinery for another 30 years or something, because we're pretty much going to need to be, shutting down and not pumping all the oil that we have, claimed and so forth, that they're actually thinking, hey, we only got another 20, 30 years left and we have to kind of dial down this industry to zero?
They don't know.
No.
We don't know. I mean, if I'm Saudi Arabia, I'm clearly thinking about how do I maximize the hydrocarbons that I have in my country. If I'm Shell or Exxon, and with 10 years of reserves on my book, I'm thinking about how am I going to maximize those, and am I going to go and spend more money exploring for additional reserves or not? If I'm a refiner, and I was talking to a board member of a company that owns 4 refineries, I'm asking myself, what is the government going to tell me to do? What are the new rules and regulations? When am I going to have to think about closing some of these refineries down, because electric vehicles are going to reduce the amount of refined products that are needed? These are a ton of unknowns, and we're all trying to figure out what the future is going to hold for us.
Yeah.
But we can either sit and wait to be told, or we can start creating some scenarios and figuring out what are the no-regret moves that we need to make to be, maybe not at the forefront, but be close to the front.
Do you see companies saying, hey, we're good at big technology capital projects and looking to, build wind farms or solar farms and so forth, or other sorts of renewable energy kind of things? Are companies going in that direction?
Well, they all are going that and are looking at it. Shell and BP in particular, the Europeans are much further along in embracing and accepting that there is going to be an energy transition. But all the companies are looking at different vehicles to continue to be in the energy industry, but maybe in a less carbon-intensive way.
Wow. Is this
so? If you want to go on from that, it's not just electricity.
Yeah.
People are exploring. How are we going to power our vehicles? How are we going to power airplanes? How are we going to power major trucks? And one of the fuels that people are looking at is hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know if that's going to take off or not, but there's been a lot of work on hydrogen as well.
Yeah, hydrogen vehicles and so forth. Find them in a few parts of the country, I guess. California, I think.
Yeah.
Tell me about what's it like in the oil and gas industry as an independent consultant? Have you found that it's an industry that very much is only going to engage consultants who have sort of deep expertise in the space? because there's just a sense that they want people who have been in the industry and outsiders can't figure it out.
Like in the industry, the white blood cells come out when you don't know the industry. There is a ton of technology and beliefs that if you haven't drilled a well, you don't know the oil industry. I'm lucky because I spent some time in Nigeria, and people then feel sorry for me. So that's my credits to get into the oil industry. But yes, it's you need to know quite a bit about the oil industry to be accepted into the oil industry.
You mentioned Nigeria. Tell me about the kind of international nature of it. I imagine that it might be more international than some industries because so much of the technology it could just be used at any well, I suppose, or any well for the right kind of geography and geology. And people often are working in relatively remote locations. Talk to me about some of those aspects of the industry.
Yeah, the worldwide demand for oil alone, not gas, is about 95 to 98 million barrels a day. The U.S. produces, I don't know the exact number, probably 10 or 12. So the U.S. is a player, but not the whole industry. Of course, everyone's heard of Saudi Arabia, and they're a large player, and OPEC contributes quite a bit of oil as well. But it is truly an international industry. Clearly the Middle East has a lot of production. Russia has production. Australia has production. But think of a country, and most countries produce oil or gas, except maybe the small little Pacific islands.
Right. And so I imagine it's a place where a lot of the people have spent time, internationally, either maybe to earn your stripes to get promoted at some of the majors. I imagine that you had to have, worked on location, either at a offshore platform or somewhere in South America or Africa or Central, Asia. Tell me about that a little bit. Is that sort of part of the culture where people are expected to be willing to, move abroad and, live in difficult conditions for some time?
It definitely is part of the culture of being international and living international and having international experience. It's a great experience because you move away from headquarters and you have to do a lot more work on your own and figure things out. But there are also companies that are pure play, domestic companies. So it really depends on which company you belong to, whether you're going to get an international tour or not.
Let's turn to your practice a bit, John. You mentioned a couple types of things that you've done, but could you give us maybe walk through one or two case examples? You get sanitized, obviously, of projects
Sure.
that you've been involved in.
We've recently had the fortune of working with on a number of mergers. It's actually been quite interesting because we've worked parallel with a McKinsey team or a Bain team, and we've carved out the supply chain and sourcing and logistics side of the business. And so, I'm thinking of one company, which was a midstream company, that purchased another midstream company, and they wanted to go in and upgrade their sourcing and procurement practices, and we came in and did a typical sort of strategic sourcing diagnostic, developed a program, and it was worth $180 million to improve their sourcing practices.
Oh, that's amazing. Can you tell me a bit some of the details of that? I mean, obviously keep it sanitized, but like what sorts of opportunities did you identify for them? That's incredible. 180 million
Well,
bucks.
One of the things that we find in the oil and gas sector is there's a lot of people that are doing things very quickly that, we've talked about non-productive time or NPT time. And so they're always rushing to do things. And if you actually look at sourcing practices and come up with better contracting terms and things like that, you can find value pools that have been untapped. So in the case of this midstream company, we revisited some of their contracts. We looked at ways that they were buying valves and pipe We looked at in pipe, you have to inspect it on a frequent basis. So there's a good example. So you have to inspect it every couple of years to make sure there's no cracks, there's no potential flaws that might cause an explosion or a leak. And they were not contracting as well as they could. They were also overanalyzing the data. So we kind of helped them to create a fit-for-purpose solution and leverage the best value for that solution.
That's cool. So they must have been spending a pretty fair amount to be able to save $180 million. That's incredible.
Yes. These projects can cost billions of dollars to lay pipe.
Wow.
I'll give you another example. We were working with was talking about a fractionation company or a pumping company. And this should give you a great example of how they don't plan very well. This company would plan on needing, let's say, 10 million pounds of sand every week, and by the end of the week, they would only need 7. So they were always going to their sand provider, we call it proppant, and asking for 10, and then over the course of the week, telling them they only needed 7. And so that sand provider was having to scramble during the week and provide the sand to other people. And how does this happen? Well, a lot of companies, they don't commit to their suppliers until the Friday before the next week. And so if you're only committing 3, 4, 5 days ahead, then the supplier has to sort of over prepare for the next week, just so they don't say no to their customers.
Mm-hmm. And how did you help them get down to a smaller number without, being short sometimes?
Well, it's working with the customer base to understand and to get them to commit to longer lead time plans. It's also in creating more transparency around the planning process, and so that they could consistently see that they were falling short. When we went and talked to them the first time, they said, "Look, we have 100% adherence to plan." And we said, "Well, how do you know that?" They said, "Well, every time we get an update, we update our plan." So what we started doing is every week we would take a snapshot of their plan and then look at the variance to plan on a week-by-week basis. Once you start looking at the variance to plan, now you can start figuring out where the problems are and addressing those problems.
Mm. That's pretty cool. So you really had to dig in there to actually, because they weren't even aware of the problem. It sounds like at least at the more senior levels.
They're aware sort of at the cerebral level, but not necessarily at the data level.
Yeah. What would you suggest to people who want to learn more about this industry? If there's any podcasts or newsletters or websites or books.
There probably are. I'm actually going to pick on a friend of mine who knew nothing about the oil industry or the petrochemical industry and got headhunted for a head of strategy for a petrochemical company. And so what I told him to do is there are a number of books out there. It's called the Non-Technical Guide to Oil and Gas, the Non-Technical Guide to Refinery by a guy named Lafler. And that's what I would start with. My intro to petrochemicals was in England, and I was told that, like any consultant, over the weekend you need to become an expert on petrochemicals. And so I bought the book on the Non-Technical Guide to Petrochemicals and read it to at least be familiar with the terminology.
That's great. And how do you kind of stay current with what's the latest going on in the industry?
There's quite a bit of research, quite a bit of industry newspapers or emails that go out, and so I subscribe to a few of those.
Fantastic. Well, John, if people wanted to follow up with you and get in touch, where would you like to share with them in terms of either your website? We can include any of these links in the show notes.
Oh, absolutely. My website is lionstuts.com. That's lion as in the animal, Lion, stutz.com. And I can always be reached on my email at jvl, John Victor London, at lionstutz.com.
And how'd you come up with the name for your firm?
Great question. That was a long and hard process because most names start sounding like apartment complexes or wineries. But my wife's the marketer in our family, and Lion and Stutz, Van Leeuwen, which is my last name, means lion, and my mother's maiden name is Stutz. So the combination of Lion and Stutz is how we came up with it.
Fantastic. All right. John, thank you so much for being on the show today. This was a great discussion.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an amazing industry, and I'd be happy to talk to some of your listeners about it as well.